Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Camilla, welcome to my show.
Thank you so much for having me, Robbie.
Would you like to let everyone out there know a little bit about yourself?
Not a problem. My name is Camilla Biase-Dyson. I'm an Egyptologist at Macquarie University. That's a university in Sydney in Australia. And I'm Australian, but I spent the last 11 years in Germany working as an Egyptologist. So it's interesting to be back home, especially during COVID, but it's wonderful to have a job back in my hometown and loving my students and the other staff. So it's a great thing to do.
Why did you particularly pick Egyptology? Because I think, I'm going to ask the dumb question. Do you think aliens built the pyramids? Which I've talked to my buddy, Dr. Paul Harrison, who's an Egyptologist. He's like, no, they built it. It's a bench. So it's like one at a time, just slowly building up and it compiled. But it's so magnificent. And we don't really know a whole lot about it, at least if you're not an Egyptologist. Like the common world does not know a whole lot about it, which I think is why everyone's so like aliens or it's mysterious. It's when you look at it, it's something of like, I don't godlike proportion, I would say. It's very, very beautiful. I've never been to Egypt, but when you even look at pictures of it, I think everyone sees the common three pyramids, and then you don't realize they're actually very, very far apart. But most photos, like for, I guess, aesthetic appeal, it looks better when they're all close together. But it's something to really like gawk at. I mean, I've been to the Grand Canyon, but that's like a hole in the ground compared to this thing. I mean, it's really just magnificent to see.
Yeah. Well, there are two big questions, actually three. The first is why I got into it. The second is sort of, how are pyramids built? And the third is sort of, how can we appraise what they were for and why they're so important? Why I got into it, I'm never quite sure how to answer. I got into it as a child. I got into ancient history as a child and just pursued that love my whole life. I especially love the texts, and we can get more into that later. And I was reading them in translation as a teen and thought, my goodness, these people are so interesting. How can we delve those depths a little bit more? So luckily, my hometown of Sydney has a program in Egyptology, which makes it pretty rare in the Southern Hemisphere. So I was just very blessed to be in the right place for that. As for the pyramids, we definitely know that they weren't built by aliens, even though they do they have something that looks like symmetry. Even the Great Pyramid of Giza, you were referring to the three pyramids on a plateau. That's the Giza Plateau, which is the pyramid field closest to Cairo. Actually, it's pretty much a suburb of Cairo now. So if you drive down the Great Pyramids Road, you're basically driving right past them. You can see all three. So they look symmetrical, but actually the Great Pyramids, no single side is identical. So it may look perfect, but it's not a perfect form.
Yeah.
But it's, and the reason for that is it's constructed on the bedrock. So they probably had to make adjustments to account for the fact that bedrock is not flat, right? Not completely. So you had to sort of create something that was going to work in that space. We know that we have mathematical texts that show that they could calculate the volume of a pyramid. So they definitely had the maths to back up what they were doing, which makes it even more amazing. You're right that pyramids were constructed via trial and error. So we do have pyramids that show a progression upwards in a step-like form. And we also have pyramids that failed, pyramids that they tried to get into a pyramidal form without the right angles, and the things just fell apart. So we have a lot of sort of, trial and error processes to get that perfect form once you get to the Giza pyramids. And the other thing that I want to mention is that we also have the hand of humans. So not only chisel marks, and there are a lot of really interesting chisel marks that can show us the kinds of quarries that they came from, so that we can see this is not some crazy stone. We know the quarries where these things were carved. We can tell from the chisel marks what kinds of chisels they were using, and what kinds of sort of effects that they were using to shear off the stone. And the other amazing thing is we even have the handwriting of the masons. Some of the pyramids, the core is standing, but the outside part has fallen away. And so in the core, there are literally blocks with the words written on it, cubit, which is the unit of measurement they use, which is like a foot. It's literally an arm's length in Egyptian. So it's very similar to what you in America say is a foot. And they gave a number of the number of cubits it was wide and long. So literally, we even have handwriting of the kinds of peoples. I doubt aliens would have had a handwriting like that, right? So I think it's like thing upon thing upon thing. You have so many questions, right? Thing upon thing upon thing that shows that this was built by guys. Can I give you one more story?
Yes.
We even have names. So there in about 2015, 2016 in Wadi El Jarf, which is on the Red Sea coast where people go scuba diving now, an Egyptologist from France called Pierre Tallet literally found papyri with a journal by a guy called Merer, who was involved in the quarrying process. So we even have the guys. We don't need aliens if we have such a complete picture of the kind of people involved, masons, scribes, and all the people who were involved in doing this. So I think I'll stop there. There's more to say, but I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. I guess most of the alien built the pyramids type thing, I guess it, like you were saying in the kind of the beginning, it's like an optical illusion. They're not 100% symmetrical. And I think a lot of the photos kind of do it injustice. I mean, we see on social media all the time of just photos of like people at jet skiing and having fun, but you don't see the whole lead up to try and get out of the hotel room to be able to go jet skiing and the whole long process. We only see the good parts. That's kind of what social media is. And with the pyramids, you only see really, really amazingly done photos. I mean, even if it's off your phone, phones are so good now, you can get like a very perfect description of it, but you can never get the full detail unless you filter affect it or you edit it, and then it ends up looking trashy. No one's going to post a trashy photo. So maybe that's part of the reason why we have these alien ideas of building the pyramids. But man, to think about the measurements back then, like to think that they were on the cusp of that. I mean, I know like if you look at Greek mythology or any Greek legend or folklore or history, there's like philosophers and all these people that were advanced in mathematics and literature and all these types of ways. But in Egypt, though, like this is what I start thinking of, is that if there's handprints, if there's all these different parts of the pyramids where everyone has these questions for, much like myself, I start to look at like, what was like my interest goes to the fact of like when they were building the pyramids, there was a weird part with religion that played a giant really part in Egypt, in my opinion, at least from my understanding, is that there was the king, which in most like medieval type Norse mythology, Greek mythology, the king was like, he reigned supreme. But then in Egypt, the king had a high priest, which eventually you saw the power shift, where the high priest or the person that was, I guess, the main voice of God, that's how they looked at him, which actually he gained eventually more power than the king did. The king was still the king, but more people believed in a person that could literally speak to the person upstairs, which you saw a power shift. And then my mind starts wondering, and I know with history, you really can't, got to be careful on how far you speculate or how far you infer or think. But when you believe that now the priest has more power than the king because he's literally the voice of God, he's the king's left hand or the right hand, the power starts to corrupt your mind in a way where it's like, he may be the king, but I'm the one that could easily move my hands and people will do what I say. And it's more of a fear aspect and a belief aspect, which is why, like I was talking to my buddy, Paul, who's also an Egyptologist. And he was telling me, throughout the years, there was that people could have took pieces from this pyramid and started building another pyramid, or like bits and pieces were taken off.
Oh, sure.
But even I know we can't infer with like protests that happen today, but to think that protest wasn't a thing that happened all the time, like this is just a basic thing people do, is like, cause a little chaos or mayhem because they're upset about something, to take pieces off of a pyramid because they build these for these kings. And then you stop believing in your king. Next thing you know, you're tearing down his pyramid. It's like throwing a brick at somebody's house. I could throw a brick at my neighbor's house. It wouldn't be nice, but if if he's cutting his lawn at 2:00 in the morning, I'm going to be upset.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to unpack there. Where am I going to start? So the period to which you are referring, whereby the high priests became de facto rulers, is a very specific time of Egyptian history following a period of civil war. It's the beginning of what we call the so-called Third Intermediate Period. And it's right at the beginning of the Iron Age. So it's a time when a lot of cultures were in shift. This was sort of just before the Greek classical age was born. And there are a lot of things that we don't understand about that period. Now, before that, we had never had a challenge of this kind. This is a very new kind of challenge. And what it was indicative of is not just the fact that a priest was more powerful, it's the fact that in the place in which that priest was active, and we're talking about Thebes, which is modern day Luxor, at the end of the so-called New Kingdom, which was the big empire period. So this was the end of the empire. In Thebes, the priesthood had become successively powerful over that whole New Kingdom period, so much so that they were literally able to to take over from the pharaoh and build themselves into temples, for instance, as the people directly offering to the god. You're absolutely right. It can happen, but it was after a time of civil war. It was a very disrupted period, and it shows that Thebes had sort of become too important in Egypt. That pharaoh, Ramesses XI, probably escaped to the north. And somehow so then there was a power sharing situation between north and south. So those high priests of the god Amun, actually, it wasn't just any specific god, it was the god of Thebes, Amun. They were in a power sharing relationship then with the north. They never ruled all of Egypt as kings. They kind of ruled Luxor and all of those affiliated areas for a couple of hundred years, while there were also kings in the north. So it was a very crazy time. But usually in Egypt, that's not the case. Usually in Egypt, right up until that period, there was the idea not only that the king is the king, but the king is the son of a god.
Yeah.
Like the state god, not, the solar god, the god Ra. And later that became Amun-Ra, but mainly the god Ra. And he also is, in a way, a god himself. So by being the son of a god, he is also, in a way, a god. A little bit like Jesus is kind of connected to God by being the son of God. Yeah. And so this did give the king a very particular role in society. And yes, he was considered to be the intermediary between the gods and his own people who he ruled over. So that's definitely the case.
I know when it comes to people building the pyramids, there's, I don't know, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy, but there's an idea that a lot of these people were slaves, and we're definitely not saying that there's not slaves that happened at the time, but I think this was more of a belief factor of when you're building these pyramids for something. It was more of like, it's kind of like with people that are in Scientology. They're not dumb people. They needed something to believe in, and their perception is warped. It's kind of like with when they were building the pyramids. I don't think maybe there were, like, obviously, like you see movies where people are getting whipped and building pyramids, but a lot of these people were also doing it because they had a belief in this king or belief in whatever that they were doing something great. So it's kind of like being tricked. Like, I think we all have been probably tricked in our lives where it's like, why was I doing that for so long? It was like, oh, because you didn't know that there was this. And it's like, oh. And I think that's what's so powerful about, like, where I get kind of obsessed with, like, Egyptology is not only the pyramids, but the factor of like right now, for instance, is a great time in innovation for technology and innovation for this. But I also think a striding point was back in the ancient days when there was more like artistic effort put into work. Like, we see digital works that are created now that are really good. But back then there was something that was like revolutionary. I mean, that was the breaking point, before we get into the Renaissance where art kind of took in a new form. But back then, like when it came to architecture, buildings now look exactly the same. A lot of houses look exactly like the house beside it because it's easy, it's manufactured, it's able to be produced like that. But back in the day, these things took so much effort where they all might not look exactly the same, even though that's what they were going for. But that's the beauty in it, is that there's no, art, whatever paintings, Leonardo da Vinci said, art is never finished, just left undone. There's imperfections in all of it. I think we are mentioning how the pyramids weren't exactly perfect like everyone sees. Some sides are a little bit different. It's like a painting. When you really examine a painting, you start to see the brush strokes where your mind at a distance fills it out. Like, your brain is constantly looking for a way to filter out the rest of the information for you before, like, I can move my hand before my brain even realizes I'm doing it. But that's a factor of my brain's I'm not thinking about it. It's just my brain's firing off something to move my hand. That's the same thing with like a painting. When we look at something, we see whatever. I have a Starry Night thing. If you see me looking over, I'm always looking at my Starry Night painting. But it's beautiful from a distance. And you get real
Yeah,
close and you start to see the brush strokes and you're like, okay,
absolutely.
so he went this way with it. And you can start to realize the steps on how it was created. It's kind of like the pyramids. Once you're able to physically see them, you can see the steps for how it was created. It's not this thing that just magically was transported Star Trek style to the ground. It was something a little bit different.
Absolutely agree, and I think your analogy of Vincent van Gogh with the artisans of the pyramids is a very apt one. Like I said, you see chisel marks,
Yeah.
so they're very much like brushstrokes. You alluded to slavery, and I think, and you also alluded to the fact that yes, there does seem to be New Age Egyptology, this sort of trivialization, or maybe just like making things a bit simpler, that slaves built it. It's a very simple answer. I think that's why, Egyptology is still so valid, to kind of address the complexity of the issue and address everything in more detail, because what that shows is kind of lack of knowledge about how the Egyptian economy works. So, economy sounds boring, or we can try and break it down in a few cool ways. Firstly, yes, slavery was a thing. And mainly came from a prisoner of war style scenario. So you would take captives, and when a king or an official was on campaign, you bring them back, and yes, they would be used as labor, and they could be traded, they could be sold, and yes, I mean, it certainly was a thing in Egypt, no doubt. But the idea of slaves building the pyramids per se is, like I said, way too simple, because it doesn't understand that actually people were contracted as government workers to do this. And they were paid, although Egypt wasn't a monetary economy, but they were given lodgings, just like a lot of people right up until the 20th century were given lodgings, and food. They were kept by the state. I think we have this really today only in kind of au pair style relationships, or, more, particular jobs. You can stay at someone's house and eat their food if you look after their kids. It's a very similar scenario in Egypt. You basically would be given a house right next to the pyramids. And yes, we have the houses. And yes, we have food remains that show that these people were being fed on the regular by the state. And yes, we have the records of the kinds of food given to these people, because we have some papyrus records, So basically, we have kind of a situation in which people were being housed by the state, fed by the state, in order to work at the pyramids in specific times. What were those times? Well, it's very likely that people were able to, work in their fields. And those fields didn't belong to them personally, they belonged to the state. And when they were waiting for crops to grow and whatnot, they could work on building works. So it was a very kind of very interesting and complex economy. You need to always give people work to do. And sometimes there's agriculture work, and sometimes there's building works. And sometimes, so these people were just owned by the state, paid by the state to do whatever needed to be done. You don't need slaves. If you've got a whole working force doing lots of things for the crown, you don't need it. That's how we presume it works, more or less.
Well, the golden flow of information is through text. I'm very, very happy that one person decided maybe we should write this shit down. It's like, yeah, that's a great idea, because you're not going to remember. But I always talk about with text, for instance, like a lot of it, there's a lot of errors when it comes to how we might misinterpret. Like I know there's some things in Greek mythology, for instance, that people go, well, it's written this way, but actually this is a word for this. And it's like, it's just a slight little mistake, which it can still lead to a big kind of error in a way. But then I bring up this idea of like, when people write blogs or journalism now, and I know you can't, everyone always says, like anthropology people, every time I talk to them, they go, you can't transcribe the feelings you feel now with the feelings back then, because time has kind of evolved. Yeah. I'm 100% belief of that. Like people freak out about like with anthropology, they freak out about like Christopher Columbus, all these things. I'm like, hang on a second. You got to think back then. Nobody thought about like all this stuff that we think of now. There was we should be happy we don't think the same. But at the same time, you cannot destroy history because of things of the past, because they're done. You're supposed to remember them and learn from them so we don't repeat our own mistakes. But with texts, so like, oh man. All right. So there has to be one person out there, or some text, like for instance, with journalism or bloggers, they put it, you read an article and you know the story of it and you're looking at it, you're like, this person left out this information. You start to realize they have a bias in something. Now, when you look through history, who's to say that one person wasn't recording something and one of them's like, I'm going to leave this out? And then there weren't that many. I mean, there were scribes back then, but it wasn't like a high journalism I mean, journalism's kind of dead now. Today's age, as long as you own a blog, you're a journalist. But
Yeah.
there wasn't as many back then, so it was very easy that there's pieces of history that we could be missing that could you end up finding in a diary from some person that was might have been building the pyramids, writing something down in small little scribblings, and that's why we have the hieroglyphics, for instance.
Yeah.
My issue with the hieroglyphics is I don't know what the hell they mean. Like I'm looking at them and I'm like, what is I and I get it, the Anubis stuff, like the Jackal Man and all these things, but I'm seeing these descriptions and there's a conspiracy out there, and I'm not a big conspiracy guy, but I like to entertain them. Um, there was one where it showed people like huge, and they had a stick that was holding pieces of the pyramid, and that's how people think that they were just these giant people back then that were able to lift these blocks and put them on there. I was like, that's a good one, but no, I don't think that's how it is. But these hieroglyphics, you're trying to interpret them, and it's very, very hard because their language of speaking is not how we speak today. Like emojis
Yeah.
can be used for hieroglyphics. That's modern day hieroglyphics. You send an
Yes,
emoji
absolutely.
plant to somebody, everybody knows what you're talking about. But
Yeah.
back then was completely different to what it is now. So us trying to use our minds of the present to understand the past is probably one of the most difficult things, because you have to set aside your biases. You have to set aside all the things that you think of. And most of the time you have to think in the mindset of back then, which is not relatively easy for a lot of people to do. It's there's a big problem with acting with emotion over thought, and I think that's why like our archaeology departments and a lot of programs are being taken down, and I'm hoping it doesn't hit other realms of science. But the word science is so flimsy at this point because a lot of people don't believe in what it is. If you're going to say that someone's belief or what they understand is wrong, then science is always kind of on the chopping block, because that's what it's known to do. It's meant to prove out the wrong and try and find the truth, but it's a constant working theory. And I've talked
Yeah.
to plenty of academics that have explained their kind of trauma with just the whole science in general, on a factor of
Mhm.
there's not a lot of people that really trust the science anymore. And
Mhm.
I I'm not above, like I'm not the type of person that wants to discern anybody's beliefs, but we
Mhm.
can't sit there and be mad at people for things that have happened in the past. And I'm noticing a lot of that, which gives people like you a major, like a credit, in my opinion, because you're studying the past and you're trying not to, think in the mindset of today, trying to understand the past by just making sure this thing survives,
Yes.
like the Rosetta Stone is probably like the best translation tablet and I can't believe they named a program after that. I thought that was a joke, but no, it's an actual
I
old tablet.
know. They went there, yeah.
But the importance of remembering or learning dead languages, they wouldn't be dead languages if we still taught those and practiced those and we made those a common field. Now, you said the Egyptology program was rare. That
Mhm.
is a rare program. It's much like trying to find a Greek mythology class in my high school or college. They don't offer that. You have to go through a bunch of other classes and pick that one specific. That doesn't even really give you a credit to any degree you really want to go for unless you're studying ancient history. And I
Mhm.
think these are things that should be more taught to us when we're younger and in middle school, high school, whatever, because it
Mhm.
helps you understand, is like you need to stop it at the forefront, which is, hey, this is how they thought back then. So don't,
Mhm.
when you're 30 years old or something, learn it and think that the world is evil and everyone's trying to kill somebody. Because, I mean, that's a main flaw in our education system, at least over here in the States, is that a lot of people don't, they find out the real history later in life. And I'm like, this
Mhm.
is why we need more budget funding or more pushing towards Egyptology and older ancient histories. So you understand, it's like there are similarities, you can
Mhm.
connect on your similarities, but look at the differences. Look how
Mhm.
far we've come as people. Back then the buildings might have been amazing. And today, compared, might be like, hey, you know what? That's kind of crappy. But our mindset has evolved so much, where when I learn about Egyptology or I learn about ancient Greece, which is my favorite, is Greek mythology, my mind starts to like, oh my God, they think kind of how we do, but this is like a more
Mhm.
primal thinking. That's the spark that should be getting your mind going. That's the important stuff.
Mhm.
That's why history needs to be remembered.
Yes, it does. And I think, the sorts of skills that you learn when studying history, One of the most famous, one of the most known or important, I think, today is the so-called reading against the grain, which is what you kind of alluded to when you said we have to also find what is being not being said, not just what is said, but what is not being said, reading against the grain and saying, okay, this is a really interesting source that tells us about this. What is it not telling us? I mean, I can give you a really excellent example for this. That's the so-called Battle of Kadesh, which was fought by Ramesses II and his troops up near in what is now called Turkey, and he went all the way up there to try and keep control of some cities, namely Kadesh and another area called Amuru. And he came face to face with the Hittite Empire, which is the empire of what is today called Turkey, who were trying to also keep control of that same area. And they come face to face. Now, in almost every temple Ramesses ever built after that time, and this was in the year 5 of his very, very long reign, over 60 years, it says he won. Now, luckily for the Hittites, a couple of cuneiform texts, which is cuneiform is the script that's used all across the Eastern Mediterranean for not only Akkadian and Sumerian, but also Hittite language, which is incidentally Indo-Europeans connected to our own. And in the Hittite cuneiform texts, it tells us that actually the Egyptians had lost all that territory. And in fact, we don't have any documents that show that the Egyptians were able to keep it. So it's basically just pure propaganda, what Ramesses was saying. And he published it everywhere. And it was even copied down by scribes in his time as being the story. So basically, Egypt believed one story, but history has shown us that the opposite is the case. So
it's
you have
the damn
to
Crips
find
and
other
Bloods.
sources. You have to read against the grain. You have to understand what is not said in history, and we're not being critical enough. As you said, we are not critical enough.
It's literally like the story of Romeo and Juliet. Like I translate that to the same thing with Crips and Bloods. They're fighting over stuff they don't even know what they're fighting about. It was one probably small mishap that has just been 30, 20 years, 40 years, whatever, of just chaos that no one wants to get to the bottom of. And I think history is written by the winner. But imagine if you refuse to lose.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Right?
Oh, man.
And we saw this in the election of last year in the States, right? We literally have a whole party believing that they won, but were robbed. And we have the rest of the country quite clearly seeing that there had been a win by Biden, right?
Yeah.
And it's an alternate history. So basically, Ramesses II did exactly the same thing 2,500 years before, And this is possible, 3,500 years. What am I saying? Right? So nothing changes, in other words. It's wild.
I thought of a joke. I was going to say, you think Trump lost the election? No. It's going to be really messed up. I feel so bad for future generations if the human race makes it like another 100 couple of years. I don't know. Because it's like every single, and I want to get, I don't know if this happened in ancient Egypt, but like for Romans, Spartans, all these like Native Americans, for instance, a lot of downfalls of civilizations come when you start tearing down ideologies. Like, I think that's why it's important we have religions, for instance. Like, you need to believe in something, even if most of the world right now is not really religious, but you kind of start ripping up holes in boards all because you don't like the way that someone thinks. And usually the last ideology, I heard this from some type of, somebody on Joe Rogan's podcast talked about how the last kind of belief is the idea or ideology of gender. And that's when civilizations start to fall. Now, I don't know if that was like that in ancient Egypt, because I think it's a lot more common now, but back in the day, there were accounts of people that believed that they could actually, Native Americans believe that if you could think like a man and a woman, you were actually the most powerful. It was more about an understanding point. And in ancient Egypt, is there a point where there was a lot of people that were transgender, or because there's mythologies in Greek mythology, a story about I forgot what the name of the person is, but it was a guy that was like this hermaphrodite. Yeah. So that comes from that. And I'm like, look, if this is basic text stuff that has been written 1,000 something years ago, that's still recorded in history. So it's not a new thing. It's a normal thing. But I'm wondering, is this like, did they have something like that in ancient Egypt where they believed that you could be a man and a woman?
Actual discourse about hermaphroditism doesn't really exist, but But fundamentally and very importantly, it is key to the Egyptian creation myth, because the name of the created god is Atum, which means in the Egyptian language, Temul means the complete one. Now think about what completeness means. In an Egyptian sense, it means he is male and female at the same time. And he through a process of, I hope you won't mind me using the word, through a process of masturbation, his semen creates babies without requiring a womb. So he is complete. He is Temul, right? He's complete in the Egyptian sense. So his sperm will automatically generate an embryo to create two babies, who then, being male and female, create more babies, and therefore engendering creation. So the idea is that you can have one God that can be the creator God. And that's based on an idea of being like a plant, having both genders, basically, and being able to self-pollinate.
Where do you think a lot of this like ideas, like I know you like the texts and the scripture part of things, but is there, when it comes to religion, for instance, where do you think these ideas came from? Like, I mean, I always like to wonder the idea of who created, like, who thought of the idea of Christian religion, or, you know, we have stories, of course, but who had like the basic idea? And I had talked to a lot of people that like, we know that there was water in Egypt, but like, for instance, like when you're driving, you can see like hallucinations or mirages. Do you think this is where a lot of their stories came from too, being out in the desert 24/7, is like eventually you're getting mirages, and this is why we see art and hieroglyphics of these giant half man, half jackal type things? Or do you think that's a starvation aspect?
I don't think, I mean, the idea of there being giant jackals, I would question already, right? The fact that Anubis is a known god,
Yeah.
he is associated primarily with the desert, right? And because, of course, jackals are found in the desert, and this comes back to what's now going to become my central point. All religions are based around the natural world, because we interpret the natural world as also being connected to the divine, right? And that happens very early. Giant jackals out in the desert, we might have, I don't know what that's referring to. There are certainly, I mean, there aren't really many temples to Anubis as such, but we certainly have Anubis shown in large form on temple walls. But that's because scale is important. Gods are often shown as above life size. So there's no sort of idea, like they are huge on temple walls, but temple walls are huge.
Yeah.
So that's why it's just scale. So I think people are getting themselves a bit worked up about something that is quite trivial. But in terms of belief and how it came to be, I don't think there is an idea of hallucination or mirage. I really do think it's all about empiricism. It's about observation. What happens in a day in Egypt? You're out in the desert, and what happens? Well, for one, the plain is flat until you get to the mountains. So you're literally, and also that river cuts due north-south. So what happens? You literally see the moment of the sun rising in the east, you see it cross the sky all day, and then you see it set in the west. And it's quite literally happening right over your head, because you're standing on the riverbank watching it go right over your head. So what happens? Well, the sun god becomes key to Egyptian religion. He gets linked to the creator god Atum, who I talked to you about before, and he gets linked to a lot of the other state gods. His passage in a boat across the sky becomes the key, not only to the religion, so the ritual that is played out in the temple every day, but also in the idea of the netherworld. So the Egyptians thought basically you would be like, when you die, join the sun god in this solar boat across the sky every day, and then go down into the netherworld where the sun god goes, and spend another 12 hours crossing through the netherworld at night, which is sort of connected either with the underworld, so the bottom of the earth, or the other side of the sky. They had two different competing ideas there. But that's key to most of Egyptian religion, right? The natural environment. There's also a god for the Nile. You talked about the inundation. Yeah. So Hapi, the Nile god, basically controls the inundation as it comes every year. All of these things that are just key to human experience: water coming up, water going down, sun moving across the sky. That's how they constructed their own experience. That's how they, negotiated their own reality on a daily basis, and on a cosmic and on a ritual basis too.
Yeah, that's kind of like my point of understanding religion, is that it's needed a belief, because when you look at all these being created, it's just to understand that the world you're living in, and that's the weird part about this
That's
world, is that we might have scientific answers for a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of stuff we still don't understand. And
yes.
it's so unexplainable because
Yeah.
there's nothing that we've ever seen like it. It's never, there's, you can't in one lifetime, and even lifetimes, or civilizational periods, you can't really understand the full grasp of what this place has to offer. Things get whacked out of balance and they get set right back onto place. And I don't
Yeah.
know if it's a constant shift of yin and yang back and forth,
Mhm.
but especially if you're trying to worry about like, oh, we haven't had rain in a week, and then you're going to sacrifice something, and then next thing
Yeah.
you know, it rains the next day. It might
That's
just
right.
it might just be the balance, but now you've literally constructed in your reality of that whoever did that, that there is a God out there you just sacrifice something for, and that's how you have all these sacrifices and all these things that happened back in the day. It wasn't I mean, it was barbaric in the sense of how we look at it now, but it was a natural
Really?
thing that they did to, well, I mean, if you ask someone like today, if you looked at Norse mythology and you said one of their rituals, they would be like, holy shit, they did what with the person's lungs? It's like, yeah, but you can't, you gotta
No.
think
Yeah.
back then. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's certainly true. But mind you, we still, break the bread. We still drink the wine.
Yeah.
So the idea of ritual being connected to the real world is still very much there. It just has a slightly different form. But okay, you're right. I mean, there certainly has been change over time. But the idea that the Egyptians offer to the gods so that the sun will rise and set every day in the right way, the sky will not come crashing down on the earth as they thought might happen in an apocalypse. So if you keep offering to the gods and the sky does stay up there and the sun keeps moving, then it's basically just a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So it means that it's working. That literally, the ritual is obviously working if the sun keeps rising and
Yeah.
setting every day. And I think that's fundamental to religion, right? So the idea that we feel supported in life because there is a God in our life, well, that just keeps fulfilling itself because you're going to keep feeling the presence of the deity in your life. And that's fine. And you can challenge it, but faith is faith. It always has been and it always will be. If you believe there's someone on your side, then there's someone on your side. No one can really disprove it.
Oh,
And you're right that religion does have a very grounding, a very binding sort of idea. It's community building, and you're right when you say that the loss of it in many societies has been a problem. And I say this as a non-religious person, mind you. I would not say I
I'm not
affiliate
religious either.
No, I'm not religious, but I see that with the loss of religion in many world communities, there has been a loss, a lack of community. People have gone more into themselves. There has been more focus towards consumerism, towards just self-identification as something, people grasping for ideas, becoming very diffuse, and sometimes very combative. And yeah, I mean, I see your point there.
I wonder if
Yeah.
throughout ancient history, if there were people younger that were having identity crises, like how we have today. Like the number of identity crises are literally, but I mean, not in the aspect of like one of these ancient Egyptians were like laying in like their rock bed, and then next thing you know, they're playing Green Day, like most kids our age or my age back in the day did when you had teenage angst. But I mean, in a sense of like trying to discover who you are. And I think that is important to know about. I don't know if that happened back then.
It did. We
Okay.
have the most beautiful text. Actually, I've got a couple I could talk to you about. Well, one is really beautiful. It's to be found now in the Berlin collection, in the new museum in Berlin. It's a really lovely papyrus and it's unique. So it's a single manuscript and it's called The Dialogue of a Man with His Bar. And a bar is an element of the soul in the Egyptian thinking. And this man is feeling suicidal. He's feeling lost. And he says, death is before me today. And he describes all these beautiful things, like the smell of incense, these, having a holiday. He says death is welcoming him, like those beautiful things. And his soul is talking him out of it. His soul is saying, you have to think about, life, and you have to live for things, and you have to think about what's important. And the soul keeps trying, and it's a dialogue between the two. The whole text is this dialogue. So he says, what am I going to do, my brother? I feel death beckoning to me and I don't know what to do. And the soul is trying to be the sensible voice, the angel on your shoulder, if you like, talking him out of it. And it's, like I say, it's a unique text, but it's an incredibly powerful text. It was published in English many times, but Jim Allen of Brown University published a beautiful one. If you ever want to look it up, you can read a lovely
You'll have to
translation.
send me some of these. I'd love to have you
Yeah,
back on to talk a little bit
it's
more once I can actually study a
yeah.
bit.
Yeah, it's a really incredible text, and it does show us that even in the ancient world, people could really plummet to the depths and have to commune with their soul in order to find meaning.
It's like my
Yeah.
biggest theory about the afterlife is the exact theory I would say comes out of ancient Egypt or ancient Egypt, which will be weighing your options kind of type deal. But more
Yeah.
like when you die, if your body is a vessel to the afterlife, I don't want to be cremated because I don't want to be a pile of ash in the afterlife. I don't know if it's necessarily like that, but it's got my whole mind shifted on the way my body gets processed into the afterlife. And I think
Yeah.
that's because I think that's also a key link with religion is where do you go when you die? It's about understanding. And I think, for instance, if you
Yes.
say that when you die, your options of all the good things you've done weigh with the options of all the bad things you've done, and whatever the scales tip, decide where your
Yes.
fate is going to be. That's a great way to keep people nice. I'm just saying.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful, and you know there is this really fascinating way that good behavior gets codified. I mean, chapter 25 of the Book of the Dead, to which you're explicitly referring, when the person stands before the god of the dead, Osiris, in that big hall, and his heart is on those scales against the feather of justice. You know, justice is literally manifested as feather, which stands for the goddess Ma'at, or goddess of justice, and you're literally trying to weigh a heart, and it has to be lighter than a feather. And you have this chapter 25, which is, you know, I didn't steal, I didn't cheat my neighbor, I didn't, and you're going through this whole litany of things that, you know, a good person would do, and that becomes so codified in the society. It's fascinating, and it is very much like the Ten Commandments. So yeah, there are certainly sort of codified ideas of behavior that are connected to these netherworld texts in a very powerful way. And what's interesting is that if you pass through that hall of justice, you can become a justified one because you have been declared as justified before the God, right? And as a justified one, you are called an ach, which means sort of an effective spirit. And that's kind of every Egyptian's dream come true. If you can literally become one of these effective ones, you can commune between the world of the dead and the world of the living. You can still see your neighbors, see your children. You can still get offerings in your tomb because you can come out and you can be active. And that's something, I guess, that a lot of people long for, eternal life. And the Egyptians had this very specific way of thinking about eternal life. If you could pass through that hall, and if your body could stay whole, that's even the better case scenario, because then your spirit always has a place to rest, you know? And that's why they came up with mummification. Mummification is in order to have, you said a vessel, you were right. You need a vessel. And a lot of spells in the so-called Book of the Dead talk about the body being jar or whole. It's very important to have a whole body that the spirit can then come and rest in. And yeah, so yeah, you're right. It is a really fascinating way of thinking about what happens when you die. So they've got lots of insurance policies for that.
I just thought of a insurance policy. That's a good
Yeah.
one. But I just thought of a great movie idea. It's like, what happens if someone like, because there are people that die today and then they come back, not like CPR related, but just a random thing, like someone might mistakenly think they're dead. Imagine that back then. Then you're an
Yes.
effective spirit. People would think of you as an effective
Yeah.
spirit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you see, the idea of an effective spirit, or an ach, is so powerful that the Egyptians wrote, I don't know if you know about this already, you can tell me if you do, they actually wrote letters to them. And they would, okay, you can imagine what's the best way to communicate with an ach? Well, you have to go to his house. So you go to the tomb. And well, best case scenario, you want to do it in a way that's going to make him come out and read the letter. So you write it on a dish or a plate, and you you fill the plate with food, and you go to his house and you put it there for him, and you hope that he's going to read it. So, or he or she, actually, they're so male, female, and so we have a number of these plates, not that many, but quite a few. And they address the ach, the effective spirit, in the following way. So, you know, something terrible's happened to me. Either you've done it to me, or someone you know in the netherworld has done it to me. So I want you either to behave and think about all the nice things I did for you, or take that other person who's doing it against me to court in the netherworld so that they'll be nice to me. So we have this whole parallel universe. Like, these amazing letters on plates are basically giving us a portal to a completely different plane of reality with courts of justice and people walking around literally taking each other to court. You're making my neighbor's servant sick. What are you doing? I'm going to take you to the court, so that you can behave. It's fascinating.
It's kind of like the Salem witch trials. Like eventually there was just a bunch of people saying that this person was a witch. And next thing you know, that person would be tried as a witch. And then that person would own that person's house. It's like, oh, I needed a nicer house, so I just called that person a witch. That's a lot of power for just, oh man.
It's crazy crazy amount of power that these, well, I mean, they were dead people, obviously, but we have a lot of spells also to ward off these effective spirits, because they could be nice and they could be terrible to you. So you need to have plenty of spells to try and keep them in their place, for sure.
Is there anything that you've read or you've kind of discovered through your work with Egyptology that you find that you have an issue with, or one thing that you just really don't understand?
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting question. Sometimes, I mean, I read a lot of texts. I read texts for a living. And I guess I'm always wondering about what the story behind these things is. The period that you mentioned right at the beginning of our talk about the civil war, when you said the priests of the god Amun had become rulers of the land. Mm-hmm. There's so much about that period that's really hazy. We don't really know which high priest took over at which time exactly, because it's all such a kerfuffle in a time of civil war that you don't actually know what's going on. So there are lots of sort of competing ideas about that crucial and crisis-ridden period. And then in the letters that you read from that period, like, you have people being sent down to Nubia. So obviously there was something going on in the Sudan. The civil war was also being fought there, and that there was crises there. I'd love to know what was really going on, because people are not, like in a war zone in general, I think you would find that correspondence from a war zone doesn't really talk about the war as such. It may talk about sort of personal circumstances, what happens to you personally, but you don't sort of have the bird's eye view. You don't have the big picture. You're basically just writing from a war zone. And so we have cases of this from Egypt, and no one gives you the bird's eye. There are no, wartime correspondence. So I find that fascinating. What happens in times of crisis?
So this is a hypothetical, but this is just my thought about it. Do you think that it's kind of like during the pandemic, for instance, since you're staying at home, a lot of people became writers or bloggers? Like there was a immense amount of podcasts that were created just at home content. Do you think that at this period that's a little bit hazy was like a little bit before there was kind of like everyone was kind of interested in writing and doing all these types of things, but then that hazy period is maybe where something happened where everyone kind of put that on the back burner to focus on something of more importance? Like if you look back, like during a war, for instance, a lot of people are writing letters to people that they love, or memories of themselves or their own perspectives or what's going on in their lives, rather than focusing on the whole grand scale battle of everything. So I'm wondering if there was maybe just because to think that like we have in the States today, and I'm not trying to translate, but I'm trying to also think in a lot of like government style ways, is that there's a lot of grasp of power that we're not paying attention to, that we don't even know about. And I'm thinking that's like what it was back then, was how many people had something like on a burner ready to take off the burner and ready to deploy their plan, then something got thrown into the mix of it. And that might be where we see a lot of this power change and struggle start to happen, is there's a lot of inner workings that we don't really have the perspective to be able to understand.
Exactly. We hear about, like, for instance, in these weird ways, like that this person who was fighting down in Nubia, who was a general, suddenly, is fighting against someone else, and you don't know why. Like you're saying, there are so many shadowy power players. People get deposed. There was a high priest of Amun, suddenly got deposed. Someone else get moved in. Why? Nobody ever talked about it.
Rip the pages.
That was it. Zip the lip. And so that period fascinates me for that reason. Yeah, for sure.
What's one thing that you really are super interested in? Not one that you don't really understand 100%, but one thing out of all of Egyptology, like maybe a story, for instance, that you just find so fascinating. It's like because I start to look at, like, if you're reading text, if you're studying anything history, whether you're an anthropologist, whether you're Egyptologist, whether you're an archaeologist, whatever, when you're looking so much in the past, and this is now kind of overcome your life a little bit. Like it's a part of you now. It's who you are. You can't think out of that mindset anymore. Like when I took psychology, for instance, now every time I have a conversation with someone or I talk to someone, I'm trying to think of other perspectives that I'm not seeing in the clear one that's right in front of me. And that was all because you start to understand a little bit more about the brain. And I start to look, if you start to understand more about ancient history, you kind of start to translate that into your own life as well too. I'm not saying you're like running around your house painting hieroglyphic symbols everywhere, but I'm saying like more of an understanding of like how there's some basic primal things that people enjoy. Like everyone always brings up the example of like a guy can just stare into a fire for hours and just nothing can be said. That's true. That is 100% true. I have stared into a bonfire and I did not need any words to be spoken, but I don't know what it is. It's just something overcoming about it. And that's a primal instinct. That's a primal thing. Anybody can really do that. So I start to look at like, do you start to examine pieces of your own life based on like old school style things that you've learned and try and see if it translates, or you try and connect the dots a little bit? And I know you got to be careful when you do that because you don't want to infer something onto the past that's now happening in the future. But the past is like the best predictor of the future as well too. So you're looking at a lot of things in the past, like, oh my God, you're telling me they had like rigged elections like they do today. I'm like, bruh. Well, that's something I wouldn't have even thought of back then. I would have thought more of the concept of maybe someone got killed and then they kind of up. That's kind of like a rigged election. Someone just dies and the next person takes over. But that's something from the past that happens in the future as well today too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could give you just so many different answers to this question. I've been thinking through a couple of options, but I'll give you the one that's kind of, it's a bit lighter than some of the others. But it's one of the funnier ones. I'm publishing a text at the moment. It's it's in a journal now for consideration, so it's on the way. It's a tiny little writing tablet. So it was a piece of wood that they'd covered with plaster and they used it like an Etch-a-Sketch. You could write on it, you could erase it again, you could write on it in ink, because Egyptian ink has a bit of binding agent, but it's water soluble. Okay, which is the idea. They actually wanted to be able to erase because papyrus is expensive, writing boards are expensive. Unfortunately, half of the board is broken off. So we only have I only have half of it to publish, and it's in the Museum of Turin, which is an amazing collection. Now, on this little writing board, it's literally a made-up story of a trial in a court in front of the gods. And the plaintiff is the body. And the body in the Egyptian, the word is a feminine word. And this is going to be very important. So the body is female, so I'm going to refer to it as her. And she's taking the head, i.e. the head of her own body, and the head is in Egyptian grammatically masculine. So she's taking him to court. And she's taking him to court. The body is taking her own head to court because she says she is tired of doing all the hard work. She's doing all the heavy lifting. All of the limbs are relying on her. And the head is all there up on his own. And he's just supported by the neck. And he's so high up that when he looks down, he sees everybody as being smaller than him, i.e. he's stuck up, right? And so it's playing with all of this language about being high and being low and being supportive. And so it's a joke, right? It's a satire because of course no body takes its head to court, but it made me really think about how much we can be really too dominated by the head. We become too cerebral. And sometimes our bodies do literally take us to court. They create chronic diseases. They can put us in hospital, and they can literally make us stop being up there in our own heads. And maybe we don't need a trial by a jury to work it out. But the Egyptians had found a funny way, a really funny way that is still funny of showing that kind of conflict between the somatic experience and the cerebral experience. And I find it almost impossible to believe that they could still be so wise and so funny and so translatable today, but they can. And that text, just for your understanding, is 3,000 years old. I can't tell you how astonished I am by the contents of it.
That's an identity crisis. Taking your own head to court. Oh my God.
It's amazing.
It's interesting when you learn about this type of stuff, like me hearing that for the first time. It kind of gives me hope in a little bit of a way, because I think, especially with today, a lot of stuff it's people looking for an answer, and they feel like this is the first time
Mm.
that we're left without any. And finding out that there's people back in the day that had identity crises, or finding out
Yeah.
back in the day that people were of other genders, I think that's
Mm.
very, very important because it helps you understand today that this is not anything new. Now you're individual and you are unique, but you have
Mm.
basic things about you as well too, where people have probably gone through the same problems as you and
Yeah.
experiences. So there's a way to get through it. And I think that's
Absolutely.
very, very important that people should be taking away from these things is that,
Mm.
you know, you are your own individual person, but
Mm.
people have been through issues much like yourself, and you might be adapted to your own, but
Mm.
you're not alone when it comes to a lot of the issues that happen in your life. And I think that's very, very important to remember.
It is, and also never to be forgotten how important a sense of humor is about it. You know, we can go through crises, but we also have to hit a point where we can see the light in that darkness. That's also a very important part about being human and being the best human you can be, is to find levity in heaviness. And I'm eternally grateful to ancient peoples for bringing that into my life and showing me that it's important to have that balance of pain and laughter, and that's what it is to be human in the end.
Well, Camilla, I really appreciate you for doing my podcast. Is there a place where people can find you? And also, I don't know if your book's going to be out or the little journal thing
The
that you,
article?
yeah.
Yeah, the article's unfortunately in German, but I'm going to do an English version soon. So watch this space. This is actually the first time. I'm sorry, I
You're
was a
so
German
good at it.
academic.
That's great. I just know
You know,
the text part where you understand all other languages. I'm over here trying to basically understand Spanish.
yeah, me too. But I will be publishing in English, and in fact, talking to you about this unpublished text, it's wild because you might be surprised, but it's never been published in English before. So I'm going to publish the first English translation that we have. So you've kind of heard it first in English, to be honest.
Spoiler alerts.
But yeah, if people want to find me, I've got basically a website at Macquarie University. So you would find me if you Google my name. I think Robbie's going to have to write my name, Camilla de Biase-Dyson, somewhere in the podcast, but I'm probably pretty easy to find. I don't think there are other working, like currently professional Egyptologists called Camilla, so probably pretty easy to find. Now I'm at Macquarie University. So my stuff website has the articles I've written. I'm on academia, I'm on Twitter, so you can find me. You can find me there. We can also put my Twitter handle there in case people want to
Yeah.
get in touch.
I'll make sure I link everything in the description. And Camilla, I appreciate you for doing my podcast. And thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast.